Today's talk is called Fully Known and Deeply Loved. And my hope is that you capture kind of God's design and why he created us the way he did. And that it encourages you, not discourages you for sure. But this idea that we're fully known and deeply loved, I think is something in our core, a core need, both of these things. And we're going to talk about it and see what the Bible has to say about that kind of stuff. Okay, so this series, here's the whole deal. We want to discover who we really are. And here are some questions I hope we'll answer throughout the series. How do you discover who you really are? If you were here 2 weeks ago, that may have been the first time you asked that question. But if you're older and 16, 17, 18, maybe even 15, maybe 14, you've already been kind of thinking about this, trying to figure out, well, who am I exactly? And how do I figure this out? Of course, in this series, we want to discover what does God say about who you are and your identity. I think that's of the utmost of importance. But we also want to identify, well, what does our society say about who we are and how we discover who we are? How do you get to there? And finally, and we'll be answering more questions than this, but these are just kind of some of the questions that all the talks will be surrounding. Why is this important to those who follow Jesus? I think it's important for everyone, but there's an added importance because of the identity that you're given when you decide to follow Jesus. Okay, so here's really quickly, this is what we've covered so far. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about there's a war going on. There's a war for your soul. We called it a war for your identity. And mainly because this war is between God and his enemy, the devil. And his minions, I guess you can call them, those who are with him. So we have this enemy that is working against what God loves and what God has designed and what God's heart is for you. And so there's two main lies that our enemy uses. And this is what we talked about 2 weeks ago, and I'm just going to cover it really quick. These two main areas of deceit the first is about who God is, right? So he wants you to have a twisted view of who God is. He wants you to, first of all, to start doubting this amazing God and how good he is. And so how does he do this? Well, in a number of ways, but the biggest one is he plants this thought that God is not enough. If you read the Genesis story where sin entered the world through Adam and Eve, this was the big lie underneath it all. God isn't enough. I need more. The second part of it is that God is not able. And so what this means is he's not able is he's still not enough. So he's not good enough. So an Adam and Eve situation, the enemy tricked Eve into thinking that God was holding out on her. It's like, oh, if you eat the fruit, God doesn't want you to eat the fruit because then you'll become like him, knowing good from evil, right? So he doesn't want you to be like him, which is the exact opposite, that God created Adam and Eve in his image. And so that was the seed of the lie, that God isn't enough, that he's holding out on you. The second part of that is that he's not powerful enough, which means he's not able, right? So sometimes we think, okay, so God's good, but is he powerful enough? I mean, you look around the world and see what's going on. Is it just out of control and he can't stop it? And so often we look around and that seed that God is not enough or God isn't able just grows. And then what happens is we don't even realize it, but we start translating that from what we see out in the world into our own lives. And so that's the first area of deceit. He wants to trick you about who God is. The second is who you are. This is why the war for your identity the battle is actually going to rage your whole life. There's going to be all sorts of things in life that happen that make you question who you are. It's just beginning as a teenager. You never kind of land and kind of, yep, I know who I am perfectly and I always will now. Right? And it's not just because it's not just about knowledge. There's more to it than that. We're complex creatures. God has done an incredible work in creating people. We're very complex. And so this second lie that you are not enough is very tricky because the best lies are true, but they're presented as the whole truth, but they're not the whole truth, right? So it's a true statement, but it's not the whole truth. And this is one of the power of this lie, because we know we're not enough. For me personally, I know I'm not a good enough dad. I know I'm not a good enough husband. I know I'm not a good enough pastor. I know I'm not a good enough whatever, you fill in the blank. I know I'm not good enough. And so the enemy, he can get some mileage out of that. Right? Or for you guys, it might be school. I know I'm not good enough in school, or I know I'm not good enough at hockey or basketball or whatever it might be. It's just that little seed, that plant. And so you start agreeing with it, and that's where the power comes from. So you can't have power over you if you're a follower of Jesus unless you agree with the lie. It's the deceit that we get entangled in. And so we start agreeing with it. But that's not the whole truth. It's a partial truth. Yes, I know I'm not enough. But God is. You see how those things are linked? And because Jesus lives in me, I am enough. Right? So it's just this true statement that he throws at us. That's why it's so tricky. Yeah, and you feel it. Yeah, I'm not enough. But you were never meant to be enough, because the enough that we end up getting compared to is someone who has more, or ultimately God. And we can never be God. We weren't created to be God. We were created in his image. And that's what we learned actually last week. Okay, so there's the war. Those are the two main lies that we need to be aware of. It's you're not enough. And it usually comes at you as an accusation. And here's the worst part of this whole thing. It sounds like your own voice. And so you believe it. It's true. You're not enough. You're a failure. You're a whatever. Those are, when it's a you are a, or I'm a is when you've agreed with it. You are is the accusation that's thrown at you. And so we have to be so careful about this, because this happens throughout our whole lives. All right. So last week we talked about being made in God's image. I love the video that we watched. It is incredible. And so these kind of three things really quickly. We learned that we are created in God's image, that God created us in his own image. It's just, wow. It's amazing. Just think about that. That God saved humanity to the very end, and he created man and woman, and then said it was very good. Isn't that amazing? In God's image. Wow. And there's so much there's like a whole bunch of talks that we could just say, what is God's image? There's so much about it, right? That'll be for another time. Secondly, we looked at that God doesn't look at the outward appearance. Like, it's not that he doesn't see it. Of course he sees it. He sees everything, is what we're going to find out today in our passage. But that he doesn't just see what we see. He sees beneath. He sees beyond. He sees into the very heart of people. And he knows, like, your motives better than you do. He actually, and we'll find out today in our passage again, that he knows you better than you do, which is pretty crazy. And finally, from Ephesians chapter 10, that we are God's masterpiece. It was such a powerful image to think of humanity as God's work of art. Something beautiful about that, isn't there? That you are a work of art, a masterpiece. And we're going to follow up on that idea in Psalm 139. So that's where we're going to today. It's one of those Psalms that you need to go back to from time to time and read. because it is one of the most encouraging things you can ever read. When you start doubting that when you start doubting God's presence, when you start doubting God's love, when you start thinking maybe I was a mistake, when you start thinking those kind of thoughts, you go to Psalm 139 because it straightens it all out. And we're not going to read the whole psalm. It's huge and it's awesome, and I would encourage you can read it at any time on your own. But we're just going to do the first 6 verses, and then we're going to skip down to verse 13 and start there. Okay, so it'll be on the screen as well here. O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. How much does God know about you? Everything. So does that exclude anything? No, nothing, right? Everything. So he's establishing something right off the start. Everything. You know everything about me. I don't know everything about me, and I've lived a lot longer than you guys. Like, I'm still discovering things about me. Some of them not so good. It's like, oh. All right, let's keep going. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts, even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say. This is crazy. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. Think about that for a second. Like, sometimes I surprise myself with what I say. God knows what I'm going to say before I say it. You go before me and behind me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Well, that sounds pretty good. It's got a big hand, though, huh? Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. So here's what this guy's doing, this psalmist. He is marveling at God's magnificence. That this God knows everything about everyone, that he misses nothing. Sitting, standing, thoughts. He knows everything. He knows what I'm going to say before I say it. He's marveling at this amazing, awesome God. Now, the next few verses are beautiful. They talk about there is absolutely nowhere you can go to escape God's presence, that he is everywhere, that he fills the earth, that you can't escape from his presence. So now he's talking about his bigness. He's talking about his knowledge to start with. The second part, he's talking about how massive God is. And then we land on verse 13 here. And this is the next part. You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Is that not a cool imagery, metaphor? What do you think of when you think of somebody knitting? Like, what's the image? Someone just sitting there, they're just knitting something, right? And sorry, in my mind, because my grandma, I don't know which one now, it was a long time ago, she knit, and it was just kind of like, yeah, it's like, for me, this picture of this old lady, right? The psalmist is like, I don't know if that was his picture, but knitting, I'm like, well, that is so cool. Like, it's a work of art, right? It's something that he's creating. He's got this pattern in his mind, and it's coming together. He's knitting it together. So cool. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. So now the psalmist is marveling over what God has done. It's like, okay, so he was knitting, the project is finished, and it's like, oh, wow. Marvelous workmanship. That goes back to last week, the masterpiece, right? How well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. So God saw you while you were just started out as a couple of cells, right? He saw you. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Okay, so now this is getting to another level here, you guys. Like, think about this for a second. This is how amazing our God is. This is how big he is. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. What? Okay, now we're getting into a whole nother level of knowledge that God has. Are you serious? Like, this is incredible. And then he goes on. So now the next verses, we're reading from the New Living Translation. These next few verses are translated differently in different versions, but the versions will tell you it could mean this as well. So this is what the NLT, this is the way they went. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God. You guys ever think about God like that? How precious are your thoughts about me? Really? They cannot be numbered. What? God thinks about you that much. He thinks about me that much. That's just unbelievable. Wow. What kind of God is this? I can't even count them. They outnumber the grains of sand. And when I wake up, you are still with me. He goes to sleep, loses consciousness, loses that conscious ability to know God's presence, wakes up to find what? Oh, he's still there. I love this psalm. And I just want to take two things from it, and then we'll go to our small groups. The first thing that we got to take from this is that God made you on purpose. You're going to face lots of opposition in our culture when we talk about being created. But there's some really, really important things about understanding that you were made on purpose. That it wasn't just a fun night your mother and father had. It was much more than that. And if that's the thoughts that are creeping into your mind, then this is a psalm that can correct them. Correct those thoughts, because you're not a mistake. You were created on purpose. Right? You might feel like that sometimes, and I know I have. I've felt like that. I know I've helped lots of teens through that stage. It was a mistake. I don't think I'm supposed to be here. But what we just read, is that the kind of God that makes mistakes? There's something about what this psalmist knows that is incredible. Like, I want it. Wow, he's looking at God and he's just marveling. It's not that the psalmist is a really, just like the holy person that never does anything wrong, doesn't make any mistakes. Of course he does. But he's able to see past that and go like, wow, this God is not fixated on my mistakes or that I'm not enough. See where that lie crept in? Why would God look at me? Why would God see me? The whole idea that you're a mistake is part of the lie that you're not enough. And it flows back into then God's not enough because he's the one who knit you together. He's responsible for your creating, for you existing. Every part of you. You're not here by chance. It's one of the I think the fatal things if you're just going to believe in evolution. Then all of this then of course you're a mistake. Or just some kind of cause and effect. You're not here by chance. Because if you're just here by chance or cause and effect, you have no meaning. You're just here. But you were created on purpose. You have meaning because you were created on purpose and because who you were created by. That is so significant for your life. Because the ultimate end of just thinking everything is just cause and effect or a mistake or chance is despair. Because then there is no purpose. There is no meaning in life. There just is. What you see, and then that's it. And that's pretty, I got to say, that fills me with despair just to think that if that was true, that's all we have. There's something in us that says, no, there's got to be more to life than what we've experienced, than what we see. There must be more than this. See, God knows everything about you. In fact, I love that the psalmist said this. He saw you before you were even born. So he was involved in every part of your creation. So here's a couple of questions. You don't have to answer them. I'm just going to drop them because I was considering them. Can we surprise God? Do you think? Is it possible to surprise God? No? I don't think we can. I don't think God is surprised. And even though that's kind of a nice feeling for us, I'm like, I guess if you had the knowledge that God has. And the second one, I've asked this before a couple of years ago. Can we disappoint God? If you can't surprise him, can you disappoint him? Because isn't kind of disappointment kind of the backside of surprise? Right? Is what you expected this and this is what happened? I don't know. Maybe not. It's one of those questions that I think is kind of fun to consider. I lean towards, maybe we can't disappoint God, because if he knows what you say before you say it, and it's nothing's going to surprise him, because all the days of your life are already written in his book. Is it possible? At least not the way we feel disappointment. Let's go with that. Anyway, there's a couple of questions you can consider. So your body, your personality, your uniqueness, your giftings, everything, talents, kind of the way you're wired, that's all given to you by God. It's all part of his creating. And even if you don't like it, God takes great pleasure in it. Like seriously. Sometimes we forget this. And I love what the psalmist says. He's wonderfully completed, that God, or complex, I should say complex. You are wonderfully complex. Like God created you wonderfully complex. This is pretty cool. Fully known, so he knows you fully, and deeply loved. That's what I feel like those last few verses communicate. And in fact, the whole psalm does. That there's an intimate relationship between God and you that you are not even aware of, because when you're born, because you're a baby, right? That God was so involved in your making, and he's looking at you and he's going like, another masterpiece. Yeah. And God has been there every moment of your existence, even before you existed. He was there. Okay, so God made you on purpose, and then, so you're known, and you're fully known. He knows you fully, but you're also deeply loved. This is the one thing that is maybe the most powerful part, because being fully known is one thing, but being fully known and deeply loved is a whole nother thing. Because I think there's something in us that this is one of the deepest things that we want, that we desire. But it's also one of the things we fear the most, that if people know us, if they really knew who I was, they'd reject me. Right? That's the shadow side of this need in us to be fully known and deeply loved. Doesn't that sound good? That someone knows your darkest, deepest, shadowiest parts, and all your good parts, and all the medium stuff, and loves you deeply. I don't know if there's a greater need. I don't know if there's something that you can desire more than that. For someone to completely know everything about you and still love you like beyond what you can imagine. Wow. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God? They cannot be numbered. It's so cool. And we often struggle to believe that God actually takes pleasure in us, right? I mean, especially when you know you're like sinning or have sinned, or you messed up again, or whatever it is. Isn't it hard to think that God takes pleasure in you? Why do you think that is? It's the lie again, that you're not enough. You're not enough for God to love you deeply. Right? You're not good enough. You're not holy enough. You're not whatever enough, right? It's part of the lie. And so we start to doubt, how can God take pleasure in me? Because we seem to fixate on our faults. So how can God, if we don't even take pleasure in ourselves, how could God take pleasure in us? I'm not saying we all don't, but man, there'll be times in your life when you don't, believe me. So in times of doubt, this is where we need to go. Places like Psalm 193, but also always reminded. This is why the gospel, the story of Jesus, is so important and so powerful in the life of the believer. All we have to do when we start doubting that we're deeply loved, fully known and deeply loved, is to think about what God did on our behalf. Okay, Psalm 139 gives us the beginning and how intimately involved he is in your life, how much pleasure he takes in you, like how much he knows you. But doubt is powerful, especially when it's attached to despair. And so this is also, and the New Testament will tell us this is what we need to think of when we think of God's love. He demonstrated it for us. That while we were yet sinners, so enemies of God, Christ died for us. That he did it all out of love. So that the relationship between us and him could be restored, repaired. So those are two powerful things. And I know I just talked about the gospel for like 1 minute. But it's the reminder, constant reminder, Jesus did this for you. And Psalm 139 gives us this basis, this foundation of, oh yeah. He knows me completely and loves me. So if you can take one thing, I guess it's two, from this talk, you are fully known and deeply loved. Hold on to that. Don't let the lie try to steal that away from you. You're fully loved, fully known. Because of these two questions we need to ask at the end of all these talks. I'm probably going to ask them. Who gets to decide who you are? The doubts? Did the doubts get to decide who you are? The bad feelings maybe about yourself? Or the feelings people have poured out on you? Bad feelings that they don't like you? Does that get to define you? Who decides who you are? And in the end, you got to decide who you're going to believe. Are you going to believe what God says and did? Right? He proved it. So he says this in Psalm 139, but he proved it on the cross. Who are you going to believe? Don't believe the lie that you're not enough. And don't believe the lie that God is not enough.